Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another Thursday night program. My name is Abby Huffman, and I'm coming at you from the Adams County Historical Society. I am Director of Programs with ACHS. And you've come at us with such an exciting time where we have a lot going on with our new building coming, but still we have these every Thursday night programs where we have a different speaker for you to give you some insight on a topic of their interest or a book they happen to have written. And tonight, I'm excited to turn it over to Jim, who is going to talk to you about the 11th Corps at Gettysburg. So, Jim, I'm going to have you take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'd like to talk about the 11th Corps at Gettysburg. And unfortunately, my thing doesn't seem to be advancing here. Hold on a second. There we go. There's always a technical glitch to try your patience here and there. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about tonight is mostly the second volume of my two-volume history on the 11th Corps. In the second volume, about half of it is dedicated to Gettysburg. Now, the 11th Corps always gets a bad reputation in most historians, so I'm hoping that maybe by the end of this presentation, you'll be at least questioning that reputation and maybe thinking along a different line. The commander of the 11th Corps was Oliver Otis Howard, who was a West Point graduate. He had lost an arm at Fair Oaks. And once Joseph Hooker took over the Army of the Potomac following Fredericksburg, he made Howard commander of the 11th Corps, replacing Franz Sigel, who had initially commanded it. In volume 1 of my history of the 11th Corps, I argue that it was Howard who was really responsible for Chancellorsville loss, even more so than General Hooker. But anyway, that's another story. Commanding the 1st Division, and I'm going to run through these first few slides somewhat quickly so we can get to the heart of the presentation. This is kind of a background to give you a place to start from. Francis Barlow led the 1st Division. Barlow had graduated from Harvard Law School and was a contributor now and then to the New York Tribune. He exhibited bravery on the peninsula, was known as a very aggressive commander, but he was also very demanding of strict obedience. On the march from Virginia to Pennsylvania during the Gettysburg campaign, he arrested no less than 7 officers from his command for allowing their troops to do such horrible things as scooping up some water as they crossed a stream. Commanding the 2nd Division was Adolf von Steinwehr. Steinwehr was a professional military person, graduated from the Brunswick Military Academy. He had been sent to North America as an observer during the U.S.-Mexican War in the 1840s. There he met a damsel from Alabama who stole his heart. They got married. He stayed in the United States and moved to New York City, to the German community in New York City. With the outbreak of war, he was elected Colonel of the 29th New York, served in reserve at 1st Bull Run, and then commanded a division at 2nd Bull Run in Chancellorsville. He was known as had a reputation of a calm and efficient officer. Commanding the 3rd Division was Karl Schurz, another German revolutionary from 1848, had been exiled because of his participation in the revolutions. He settled in Wisconsin, became active as a politician there in both the German and the American communities, was an anti-slavery orator. It said that he traveled over 21,000 miles in 1860 campaigning for Lincoln. And after the election with Lincoln's inauguration, he was made first ambassador to Spain. And then when the Civil War broke out, Lincoln commissioned him brigadier general. He led a division at 2nd Bull Run in Chancellorsville. So if you look at the top 4 officers in the Corps, 2 of them were military academy graduates, one from the United States, one from Germany. And the other 2 were people who had virtually no real military background and got their positions more for their political connections than anything else. The Army of the Potomac going into the campaign, if you look at the size, the 11th Corps, as you can see, was the smallest corps in the Army. And if you look at the other three smallest corps, three including the 11th, all three of these have one thing in common. They were all part of John Pope's Army of Virginia. When the two armies were merged after the Battle of Second Bull Run, the 1st, 11th, and 12th Corps were not really brought up to strength. So these three really were somewhat weak compared with the other three corps in the Army of the Potomac at the time. So let's get on to the campaign. The Gettysburg campaign begins on July 3rd, when Lee begins to move west and then north into the Shenandoah Valley to more or less mask his movement north into Pennsylvania. On the 13th, Union cavalry under Pleasanton surprises Stuart at Brandy Station. And on the same day, Lee's advance reaches Winchester, Virginia. Hooker, on the day that Lee reaches Winchester, begins to move north. So you can see the enormous advantage in distance that the Army of Northern Virginia has at the beginning of the campaign. On the 16th, Lee reaches Harper's Ferry, and on the 16th, Hooker reaches Centerville, with cavalry skirmishing going on in between the two armies. So essentially, at this point, the Union Army is playing catch-up, trying to march faster and catch up to Lee, who has a tremendous distance advantage over them moving north. June 27th, the 11th Corps crosses the Potomac River at Edwards Ferry. By this time, Longstreet and Hill's Confederate Corps are in southern Pennsylvania. Ewell is moving into central Pennsylvania, threatening Harrisburg. So again, the Confederates are considerably ahead of the Union troops on this invasion route. June 28th, the 11th Corps arrives at Middletown, with part of it at Fox's Gap. On the 29th, it moves north of Frederick. And on June 30th, it arrives a little bit north of Emmitsburg, trailing the 1st Corps, which is a few miles ahead of it, pretty much right along the Pennsylvania border. So the day before the beginning of the battle, the 11th Corps and the 1st Corps are leading the Union movement north, while the Confederates are beginning to try to consolidate their forces somewhere around either Cashtown or Gettysburg. They haven't really determined specifically where at that point. July 1st, Harry Heath's division moves toward Gettysburg. He runs into John Buford's cavalry drawn up across the Chambersburg Pike. Takes him a while to deploy his division, as it would under normal circumstances. And then he begins to move and gradually push the Union cavalrymen back over Willoughby Run and back toward Seminary Ridge. It's at this point that the 1st Corps begins to arrive. Wadsworth's division arrives and replaces Buford. If we turn the map a little the other direction to make it easier to work with, Archer's Alabama Brigade attacks into the Herbst Woods. Archer is captured, the brigade is roughly handled, and it retreats behind the Confederate lines to reform. At this point, Doubleday's division from the 1st Corps arrives. Doubleday on arrival finds out that Reynolds has been killed, and he's now commanding the 1st Corps. At this point, Joseph Davis, a nephew of President Jefferson Davis, decides to try and get his brigade to outflank the Federals on the north. Something like this. But as he advances, Wadsworth refuses his flank. And this is where the famous incident occurs where much of Davis's brigade is trapped in this railroad cut, the unfinished railroad cut, and eventually forced to surrender. So Davis's brigade, or what's left of it, is now behind the Confederate lines, reforming also. As that happens, Pender's division arrives. Pender deploys it and begins the 3rd division, or the last division, I should say, of the First Corps under Robinson arrives and begins moving forward. At this point, Pender begins to move forward also and pushes Robinson back towards Seminary Ridge. So by about 11 o'clock in the morning, you've got Confederates gradually pushing the Federal forces under Doubleday back towards Seminary Ridge. And then Robert Rhodes arrives. Rhodes' division is the first one from Ewell's Corps to arrive from the north. And as you can see, it outflanks the First Corps considerably. But it's also at this moment that the 11th Corps now begins to arrive, somewhere between 11 and 11:30 in the morning, depending on whose watch we decide to look at. Howard finds out that he's commanding the field as the senior officer present, so he turns over command of the 11th Corps to Carl Schurz, the ranking major general. He sends 2 divisions north of Gettysburg to try and protect the threatened flank, and he leaves Steinwehr's division back on Cemetery Hill as a reserve and also as a rallying point in case the Army needs to retire. So if we look at the northern part of the battlefield, it looks something like this. The little dotted lines are supposed to represent skirmishers. The first of the 11th Corps to arrive is Hubert Dilger's Battery I, 1st Ohio Light Artillery. It goes into battery and begins dueling with Page's battery on Oak Hill. Next, the 61st Ohio, 74th Pennsylvania arrive. Both of those are veteran regiments who had lost considerably in service. Between the two of them, they number not more than a total of 400 men. So they deploy as skirmishers in front of Dilger to try and protect the battery from the Confederate skirmishers. Then the 45th New York arrives. The 45th deploys 4 companies as skirmishers. They push the Confederate skirmishers back and capture the McLean farmstead. Wheeler's 13th New York Battery arrives to support Dilger. And finally, the 157th New York and 82nd Illinois arrive and form behind the 2 federal batteries as support for the artillery. So far, so good, at least if you're in the 11th Corps. So we have Schimmelpfennig, Alexander Schimmelpfennig takes over Carl Schurz's division. This is the first time that he'll lead a division in combat. His brigade is taken over by George von Amsberg of the 45th New York, and this is the first time that he will lead a brigade in combat. At this point, O'Neill's Alabama Brigade is sent forth to try to outflank the First Corps, which puts the 45th New York in an excellent position to offer enfilade fire. In addition, Dilger begins to fire shell over the top of the Federals and into O'Neill's brigade. Between that and the fire from the First Corps, O'Neill's brigade is very roughly handled and immediately begins to retreat back toward Oak Hill. Dilger and Wheeler then turn their attention to Page's Confederate battery on Oak Hill, and they successfully pummel it so much that it has to be withdrawn. You read a lot of things from historians about the 11th Corps, and they tend to repeat each other. You know, one generation historian is repeated by the next generation, who's repeated by the next generation. I like to go back to the original sources. Colonel Hall of the 5th Alabama wrote in his report, "My command was under a front and enfilading fire with no support and suffering very heavy loss." He actually lost about 66% of his men. O'Neill, the commander of the Confederate brigade, wrote, "We were compelled to fall back as the regiment on the extreme left, being flanked by a superior force of the enemy, gave way." The superior force was actually the 45th New York. And finally, Lieutenant Colonel Carter, leading the Confederate Artillery Battalion, wrote that Page's battery suffered heavy loss in horses and men as well. So far the 11th Corps is doing okay. Carl Schurz, now in command of the Corps, is north of Gettysburg. He places Schimmelpfennig's brigade to try to align with the flank of the First Corps. And as Krzyżanowski's brigade comes up, he places it slightly to the right and behind von Amsberg in a position where it can either guard the flank or it can be used as a reserve for von Amsberg or for the First Corps, wherever the need may arise. When Barlow's division arrives, he orders it to the right flank of Amsberg. So you have Leopold von Gilsa and Albert Ames going into position around the Adams County Almshouse, which really isn't a house, it's a whole complex of buildings. And then the flank resting on Rock Creek, with the cavalry on the left, rather on the right of the creek, guarding the flank. So what Schurz is trying to do here is to create some kind of a straight line across this very flat area north of Gettysburg, using the only real defensible features there are. One is the Almshouse complex, and the other is Rock Creek. But Barlow has different ideas. If you look at his correspondence, it's obvious that Francis Barlow did not like Germans at all, and he particularly did not like being ordered around by Carl Schurz. So he decides he has a better idea. He's going to move his brigade farther north. So what he does is move his troops on to Blocker's Knoll. There's serious problems with this. First of all, by doing this, both of his flanks are completely in the air with no protection. And secondly, he's several thousand yards from the nearest supports. This is okay when he's facing Dole's Georgia Brigade off to his left. But very soon, the rest of Ewell's troops begin to arrive from the north. Gordon's Georgians, Hayes' Louisianans, Avery's North Carolinians, and I didn't have room to put Smith Virginians on here. But suffices to say, this is not looking very good at this point. If you look at the federal forces available, he has 2,200 men. The Confederates have almost 3 times as many. So if you look at the position that Barlow takes, it's also subject to artillery crossfire from Oak Hill and from Ewell's batteries, which begin arriving and opening fire. Ames sends 2 of his regiments to bolster the flank of von Gilsa when Doles begins to move forward. But when the Confederates advance, they outnumber and outflank the federal forces, as you can see here. And the Federals have virtually no chance to stand up against this attack. Barlow is seriously wounded. Ames assumes command of the division the first time he leads the division in combat, and Harris assumes command of the brigade the first time that he ever leads a brigade in combat. As the Federals begin to retreat, Schurz sends his reserve in to try to stabilize the situation. But Krzyżanowski has about 1,400 men under his command, and he's going to be facing 4,300 Confederates. Something like this. The Federals begin to retreat. They rally at the Almshouse complex, where the Federal officers begin to establish a second line. But once again, they're completely outflanked. When you have such a small command, outnumbered by so much, it doesn't matter how long your line is, at some point you're going to be outflanked. And that's what happens here with the superior force outflanking the inferior force. Federals begin to retreat back through Gettysburg. Is this a retreat or a rout? Historians have usually either ignored this, passing it off in 1 or 2 sentences, or almost universally saying that the 11th Corps was routed and that was that, and now we'll go on to the more interesting part. Well, I prefer to go back and find out what people who were actually there were saying. So let's look at what some of the Confederates were saying about this attack on Blocker's Knoll. G.W. Nichols in the 61st Georgia said the Yankees stopped and made a desperate stand. Their officers were cheering their men and behaving like heroes and commanders of the First Water. Richard Ewell, who led the Confederate Corps, wrote that it was an obstinate contest. Jubal Early, who led the division that spearheaded the attack, wrote that it was a hot contest. John Gordon, whose brigade led the assault, in a letter to his wife less than a week later, wrote that it was the most obstinate resistance and a desperate fight. So apparently the Confederate commanders thought they had actually been in a fight. Not to mention some of the Confederate soldiers. 21st Georgia, a hard fight. Our loss was very heavy. I think they fight harder in their own country than they do in Virginia. 57th North Carolina. I can affirm that the Army met there. It was the hardest fight I ever was in. An officer on the brigade staff of Harry Hayes' Louisiana Brigade called it a heavy fire. The musketry was very severe, and we feared that Gordon would be borne back. 26th Georgia, a stubborn fight. 6th Louisiana, a stubborn resistance. 9th Louisiana, the fight was fast and furious. So unlike later historians, the Confederates who were engaged actually thought that they were in a real stubborn fight. Howard now has the dilemma, what does he do with the right flank collapsing? He has 2 brigades on Cemetery Hill. He decides to send Charles Custer's brigade to try and stabilize the right flank. They go up through Gettysburg and arrive at John Kuhn's brickyard. This is the first time that Custer is going to lead a brigade in combat. He deploys a little bit north of Gettysburg, and he's going to be facing Hayes' Louisianans and Avery's North Carolinians. The Federals are also supported by Heckman's Battery K, 1st Ohio, which arrives on their left. The first attack by the Louisianans is actually driven back, but then they're joined by Avery, who outflanks the Federals on the right. And once again, the Federal position is compromised. They begin retreating back through Gettysburg. So you have a position something like this. At about this time, Pender's division outflanks the First Corps, and Ramser's brigade begins to push back Robinson's division, the flank of Robinson division, on the north end of the First Corps line. So the First Corps is now in jeopardy as well. Around this time, Howard issues an order to both corps to retreat back to Cemetery Hill. One of what used to be Doublesley's division retreats largely through the open fields and reaches Cemetery Ridge without any problem. Wadsworth's division goes through some of the outskirts of town, mostly through the open air fields, and arrives with no problem. Robinson, to retreat, has to go back through Gettysburg. This leaves von Amsberg all by his lonesome, ready to be outflanked and captured. So obviously he has to retreat also. And the two meet in the streets of Gettysburg. The right flank of the 11th Corps marches through Gettysburg and arrives at Cemetery Hill with no main problem. If you look at a lot of the correspondence and later memoirs, some of the people talk about fighting their way through crowded streets of Gettysburg. Other Union soldiers talk about leisurely marching down Baltimore Street and arriving at Cemetery Hill. The difference, of course, is where they were. If they were on the right of your screen, they had a relatively easy time getting through town. If they were on the left, then they ran into the congestion where the First Corps and von Amsberg's brigade meet in the middle of Gettysburg. They, of course, are pursued by the Confederates, who then are able to shoot down the different streets and essentially cut off this group of Federals. Somewhere between 200 and 400 arrive at the Eagle Hotel and the buildings surrounding it and take up a position there, the senior officer present being Captain Francis Irsch of the 45th New York and the 11th Corps. They hold out until evening. when their ammunition eventually runs out. A lot of people have said, well, the Confederates, they could have gone right through and captured Cemetery Hill at that point. Well, they can't very well just leave several hundred Federal soldiers behind them. So it takes at least a couple of regiments of Confederate troops to isolate them and keep them from causing trouble until later in the evening, when eventually out of ammunition and with no hope of being rescued, they eventually surrender. So by evening, you have a position something like this. Edward Coddington, who some people consider a Bible of Gettysburg, claims the 11th Corps had a numerical advantage on July 1. Not true, as I've shown you already in some of the slides. If you look at the total amount of men available who were actually in combat that day, the 11th Corps had about 6,500, the Confederates over 8,000. And the Confederates also had an advantage in artillery that was deployed as well. Coddington claims the 11th Corps caused only 14% casualties among the Confederates, attempting to show that they fought poorly. That also is false. If you look at Gordon's brigade, which led the Confederate assault and was not seriously engaged after July 1st, it lost over a third of its entire brigade, virtually all of which was lost on July 1st. Coddington also claims the 11th Corps did not fight well because of the large percentage of missing. So I ask you, what does missing mean? Missing means missing. It means they don't know. They could be dead, they could be captured, they could be wounded on the field. Nobody knows what happened to them, so they're listed in the official reports initially as missing. This is not a good indication, as Coddington claims, that the large percentage of missing shows that the 11th Corps didn't fight well. This also is false. The 11th Corps lost 16.4%, categorized as missing. If this was a good way to determine whether a corps fought well or not, it's interesting that the 1st Corps lost 17.7% missing. Has anyone ever claimed that the 1st Corps did not fight well because they lost a lot of missing? Of course not. The whole idea is absurd. The 1st Corps lost 6 colors captured by the Confederates. The 11th Corps lost 3. On July 2, the Confederate plan was to make the major attack along Seminary Ridge, as shown here, with Johnson's Confederates on the right, attacking to draw off Federal support. Johnson did not attack as he was supposed to. So during the day, other Union units are drawn in to try to oppose the Confederate attack, including almost all of the 12th Corps being shifted over from Culp's Hill. Johnson finally attacks later that evening after Longstreet's attack on the left on Cemetery Ridge has already been defeated. By that time, only one brigade of New Yorkers under George Greene is left to defend Culp's Hill. Fortunately, Greene was smart enough to have his troops dig in as soon as they arrived on the battlefield the previous day. And he's also helped by woods and a hill with a lot of rocks and boulders. So it's a really good defensive position. But one Federal brigade is now going to be attacked by Johnson's entire Confederate division. Greene calls for help, and the 11th Corps responds by sending a brigade. 2 of the regiments are aligned on the right to protect the flank from being outflanked by Confederates, and the other 2 regiments are sent into the trenches to relieve some of the 12th Corps regiments that are by this time running out of ammunition. The 11th Corps units are later praised in the reports of Generals Slocum, Greene, and Wadsworth for their effective combat in helping to preserve the Culp's Hill position. General Greene in his report wrote, "These regiments rendered good service, being sent into the trenches to relieve our regiments as their ammunition was exhausted and their muskets required cleaning." One interesting thing that happened was after the Confederate repulse, one of the Union officers approached Lieutenant Colonel Selman of the 82nd Illinois, a unit in the 11th Corps, shook his hand and said, "If you had been here yesterday, instead of that damned 11th Corps, we would not have been driven back." Salmon later wrote that he responded, "You are a miserable hound, sir. I and my regiment belong to that same 11th Corps you were speaking of, and we did no worse fighting yesterday." I suspect he said something a little stronger than hound, but at least that's what he later wrote. Just as the fight on Culp's Hill was concluding, two of Early's brigades attacked Cemetery Hill. There's a problem with the Cemetery Hill position. There's artillery on top of Cemetery Hill, but as you can see from a modern photograph, where the artillery was placed was behind the crest of the hill. It was never placed with the idea that it would be protecting the hill. It was placed with the idea that it could fire at long range. These were 3-inch rifled guns from Weidrich's battery. They were placed with the idea of firing to the right and north of the town of Gettysburg to support troops on the first day. If the Confederates are coming from the left and above, and you try to train your muzzle down to shoot at them, you're going to be shooting into the dirt. These were too far back to actually protect the hill. If you look at the bottom of the hill, the rebels were approaching from what would be the top of your screen. The Union line was along the small stone fence to the bottom. If you take a magnifying glass and look at this stone fence is not very high. This is not really a stone fence. It's the stones that were thrown in between the different farmers' plots to mark the boundary on the one hand and to clear the fields for plowing on the other. If you look through the magnifying glass, the fence is only 2 to 3 stones high. In some cases, 4 at the most. So it's usually about 2 feet high, in some cases maybe 3 feet high. And you can see from this horse in the background, even though it's in the background, it's still taller than the fence in the foreground. This is not the same kind of stone fence or stone wall that you saw at Fredericksburg. This is a loose formation of rocks thrown in between the fields. If you also look at the shape of the ground, the Confederates coming from the background have to go up this small hill and then over to get to the Union position, which effectively hides them from Union musketry fire. Once they appear above this hill, then they're in range of the Federal infantry. But after they fire once, the Confederates are quickly in among them. So this is, despite the fact that this is a hill, it's not really a tremendous position to defend. The Union defenders number 1,100, the Confederates 2,100. Ames was expected to cover 600 yards of front. If he spread out his men, he would have 1 man every 2 yards with no local reserve. There was no division reserve since that had been sent to Culp's Hill to aid Greene's division and Greene's brigade in the defense of Culp's Hill. The only reserve were 2 regiments under Colonel Krzyzanowski in the Evergreen Cemetery. So if we look at the disposition, we have von Steinwehr's division here, Harris's brigade here, followed by von Gilsa. They had so few troops that they had to borrow the 33rd Massachusetts from von Steinwehr to reach out toward Culp's Hill, where Whittier's battery was in place. The reserve being here in Evergreen Cemetery. And if you'll notice, there's a hole right in the middle of the line. There simply were not enough troops to fill out the entire line. There are going to be faces Hayes Louisianans, Avery's North Carolinians. Somewhere along the line, somebody noticed this hole in the line. So someone sent an order to Harris to fill up that hole, and he ordered Major Brady, commanding the 17th Connecticut, to fill the hole. What he probably meant was for Brady to send some troops over to fill it, but not his entire regiment. Somewhere along the line, the order gets misconstrued, and Brady moves his entire regiment over to plug the hole, which of course leaves another gap where he left. And it's at this minute that Hayes attacks. He drives two of the regiments back up the hill where they rallied. We know they rallied, not only from reports, but from the fact that the 107th Ohio captured the colors of the 8th Louisiana in the fighting around Weidrick's Battery. The other two regiments are stopped cold. Whittier opens fire against Avery's flank, causing them to move a little off to the left. The 6th North Carolina is stopped cold. The other two regiments break through the two smallest regiments in the entire corps, numbering together less than 150 men. And they're stopped eventually when they rally back at Ricketts Battery. Krzyżanowski leads his two reserve regiments, and they drive the Louisianans back down the hill and out of the gun, out of the emplacement. Major Tate, the senior surviving North Carolina officer, reported that the enemy stood with a tenacity never before displayed by them. The leader of the 57th North Carolina wrote, "We were under a desperate fire. Only a few got to the batteries and could not hold them. There was harder fighting today than ever I knew of before." The leader of the 1st Corps Artillery, Colonel Wainwright, who had previously disparaged the 11th Corps, wrote that they actually fought splendidly, sticking to their guns and finally driving the rebels out. The Germans, he wrote, have got fight in them. How have historians treated this? One historian wrote that 2 brigades of the Union were decisively beaten by 2 brigades under Harry Hayes and Isaac Ivory, despite the fact that they had 24 hours to rest and fortify and were fighting on the defensive. 24 hours to rest. I'm not sure what battle he was talking about, but all of these troops were in action on the 1st. Beginning early morning of the 2nd, there was sharpshooter fire. Throughout the afternoon, they were under 2 to 3 hours of artillery fire. I'm not sure what kind of rest this author was talking about, since they were in combat continuously for almost 2 days. 2 other authors wrote that the Confederates fought their way up and over stone walls and abatis, lunettes and other earthworks, and defeated them, capturing numerous artillery pieces in the process. Well, there was no abatis. The lunettes were simply some earth that was thrown up to try and protect the guns. There was no real stone wall other than this concoction of rocks that the farmers had thrown up, and they captured absolutely nothing. Confederate losses, if you look at Confederate reports at the time, their losses were 35.4%. So they lost over a third of their men in the attack. At the end of the assault, all of the federal guns were still in place. They were all occupied by federal troops. Every single foot of ground that the Federals had occupied before the attack was still in federal possession. And if you look at Confederate reports on how many men actually broke through, only about 4.8 of the Confederates actually made it to break through at all. So this was not a major breakthrough, as a lot of authors have insisted, and it certainly was not a major failure of the 11th Corps. On July 3rd, when Pickett begins his charge, 11th Corps artillery on Cemetery Hill is able to fire against the left flank of Pickett's charge. As the charge comes home, Wheeler's battery is sent to replace a federal battery near the copse of trees, the center of the attack, because the federal battery had run out of ammunition and was withdrawn. A lot of historians have wrote about how the Vermont Brigade was able to outflank the Confederate right. But almost no one has mentioned that two regiments from the 11th Corps did exactly the same thing on the Confederate left, helping to defeat that portion of the Confederate attack. So let's look at some of the results. The 11th Corps lost the second highest percentage of casualties of any corps engaged at Gettysburg, only the first outranking it. If we look at divisional losses, the top four, two of them from the 1st Corps, two of them in blue from the 11th Corps. If we look at regimental losses, among the top six, three were from the 11th Corps. On July 1st, the 11th Corps marched over 13 miles in 4.5 hours through rain, through a sun, through humidity, to prevent the 1st Corps from being outflanked. It helped to defeat O'Neill's attack and crippled Page's battery so much it had to be withdrawn. It fought well at Blocker's Knoll, although seriously outnumbered and outflanked. It rallied at the almshouse until again outflanked. It rallied in town and held the Eagle Hotel, hindering Confederate operations attempting to pursue. And then it rallied on Cemetery Hill and held that key position. On July 2, Weidrich's battery helped to decimate Latimer's battery, Confederate battery on Benner Hill, which I didn't really talk about, but was an important event. The Corps held firm under a very lengthy bombardment in the afternoon of July 2. It provided material aid to the 12th Corps to defend Culp's Hill, and it held Cemetery Hill against the Confederate assault. On July 3rd, it once again withstood a lengthy Confederate bombardment of somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. Major Osborne, the man in charge of the 11th Corps artillery, cited the guns that were playing on Pickett's charge. Wheeler's battery added support to the heart of the defense of Cemetery Ridge. And two of the regiments in the 11th Corps outflanked the Confederate attack on the left. So they all added materially to the defeat of Pickett's charge. 3 people in the 11th Corps were issued medals of honor for Gettysburg. Captain Irsch, whose 45th New York fought valiantly north of Gettysburg. And then it was Captain Irsch who also led the defense of the Eagle Hotel that prevented Confederates from moving quickly through the town of Gettysburg. Charles Stacy in the 55th Ohio. On July 2, when Confederate and Union sharpshooters were exchanging fire, Stacy crawled out into the middle of the field under Confederate fire, hid behind a fence post, and attempted to find out where the Confederates were firing from and to direct federal attention to repress that fire. And Richard Enderlin was an interesting case. Enderlin was signed to the hospital corps, but when the fighting broke out, rejoined his regiment, the 73rd Ohio, and took part in the sharpshooting and the fighting on July 2. When he heard cries from one of his regimental mates in the 73rd, who was wounded out between the lines in the field, calling for help and water and assistance, Enderlin crawled out under Confederate fire to rescue his comrade who was out in the middle of the field between the opposing lines. Reaching him, he was able to grab a hold of him and pull him back to Union lines in safety. For better or worse, the person he rescued was the great-grandfather of President Richard Nixon. So I hope by showing you what the 11th Corps actually did at Gettysburg, and I hope that by going back to some of the original sources of Confederates who opposed the 11th Corps on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of July in 1863, maybe you'll get a little bit better impression of what happened and what they contributed to the Union victory, other than reading some of the more modern historians who simply tend to repeat some of the unfounded accusations of previous historians. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation and the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate that. Love getting to hear a little bit about
Thank you.
the 11th Corps. Thank you all so much for watching today. Stay tuned next week for another speaker, another interesting topic, Civil War related or some sort of history related. We've been kind of branching out a little bit. But thank you for your attention. Thank you so much. And Jim, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Abby. I appreciate it.